Hello and welcome to Consider the Truth. My name is Scott, and my goal is to help anyone listening to apply greater truth to their life. Today I wanted to talk about polygamy because it's a big part of the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. A lot of people have some issues regarding that, and they don't understand all the history and details surrounding it. And there's a lot that the church has put out about it that I think a lot of people haven't read before. So, to help with that, I'm going to read it for you. And if you've already read all these things, maybe don't watch the video because I'm just going to read them. Anyway, I'm going to start off with this one. Here, let me go back to show everybody how I get into this. So if we go into the church history on the gospel library, we'll go into Joseph Smith's Revelations, and then scroll down to section 132, where it talks about polygamy. Then it gives us this historical introduction, and I'm going to read this, and then I'm going to read the gospel topics essays. And there's a kind of a general one, and I'll read the general part, and then there's a link for each about the beginnings and about in the church, and so I'm just going to read everything. And there's also more to be found in the saints, which is really interesting. I'm not going to read that, and I'm not going to read section 132. So if you want even more, if this isn't enough for you, that's where you could find even more information. But this is a lot. So we'll see. We'll see how long this gets. I have no idea how long this will take to read. All right. We'll just start right here. Historical introduction. Also, before I get into this, I think it's important to note that Joseph Smith and then President Nelson, quoting Joseph Smith, said that we each have an Abrahamic test coming. It's something that'll pull and try our very heartstrings, he says. And does that mean the law of polygamy, of plural marriage, is coming back and we'll be practicing it soon or before the millennium? And the answer to that is I don't know. I think a case could be made for a yes and a case could be made for a no. So I think it's important to understand that maybe it does come back, and if it does, we need to have a testimony of this principle before it does. The other thing that's important about this is that there's a lot of people that will accept Joseph Smith as a prophet, and they'll say that Brigham Young wasn't a prophet, or Joseph Smith was fallen, and I don't know, they'll come up with saying Brigham Young basically instituted the law of plural marriage, and if Brigham Young did that and he wasn't supposed to, then everything since then wasn't supposed to happen either. President Nelson wouldn't be a legitimate prophet. And so it's important to understand that this did come from Joseph Smith because a lot is riding on it. So anyway, with that in mind, we'll get started. Also, I've had this cold for like 2 weeks. I might sound a little bit funny. I apologize for that. On the 12th July 1843, Joseph Smith dictated a revelation in Nauvoo, Illinois, on eternal and plural marriage. Since the mid-1830s, Joseph Smith has evidently been teaching some monogamous Latter-day Saint couples that their unions would endure into eternity if they remained faithful. Although the origins of plural marriage among the saints are obscure, later accounts state that Joseph Smith received a commandment from God sometime in the 1830s to enter into the practice. Several Latter-day Saints later reported that Joseph Smith married one plural wife in the mid-1830s while living in Kirtland, Ohio, and by the early 1840s, he had discreetly introduced the doctrine and practice to a number of trusted women and men in and around Nauvoo. By summer 1843, Joseph Smith had entered into about 25 confidential sealings, or plural unions. While evidence of these activities is found in contemporaneous documentation, Joseph Smith did not commit to paper a revelation outlining the doctrine and practice until dictating the document featured here. Joseph Smith's first and only publicly recognized wife, Emma Smith, showed marked ambivalence toward her husband's secret practice of plural marriage, at times rejecting the doctrine and at other times reluctantly accepting it. However, by July 1843, the practice had become a major source of distress between them. In hopes of alleviating the tension, Joseph Smith's brother Hiram Smith urged him to dictate a written revelation to persuade Emma of the divine origin of plural marriage. The resulting revelation expounded principles behind both plural and eternal marriage. Joseph Smith's teachings on the eternal nature of marriage expanded upon the wider culture's view of marriage as a civil contract. Christians believed that the resurrection of Jesus Christ assured them an afterlife with eternal rewards. Early Christian theologians debated the nature of relationships in the afterlife, with many claiming that the afterlife would involve reuniting with family members or meeting prominent religious figures. By the time of the Reformation, English Protestants began formulating ideas about the nature of society in heaven that included the continuation of family or friend relationships. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Americans increasingly viewed marriage as a union based on love, romance, or passion rather than utility or mutual economic benefit. This new outlook on marriage was reflected in religious beliefs and individuals anticipating maintaining earthly ties and relationships in the next life. Joseph Smith's contemporaries increasingly developed a belief in heaven as a place where they would not only glorify God, but where they could also continue to love their spouses, family, and friends. This rich Christian context then offers a backdrop to Joseph Smith's teaching that marriage, when performed under priesthood authority, could last into the eternities. In May 1835, William W. Phelps, who was visiting Kirtland, Ohio, wrote to his wife, Sally Waterman Phelps, about this development. Quote, "A new idea, Sally. If you and I continue faithful to the end, we are certain of being one in the Lord throughout eternity." This new doctrine prompted some church members to consider an eternal perspective. The doctrine not only clarified the eternal duration of the marriage bond, but also taught that marriages, when sealed by priesthood authority, could unlock individuals' eternal potential. In April 1843, Joseph Smith taught that the same sociality which exists among us here will exist among us in the hereafter. But the sociality was based upon rituals performed through the priesthood. In May 1843, Joseph Smith explained that except a man and his wife enter into an everlasting covenant and be married for eternity, while in this probation by the power and authority of the holy priesthood, they will cease to increase when they die. He additionally taught that those who are married by the power and authority of the priesthood in this life would continue to increase and have children in the celestial glory. The revelation featured here specify that those entering into this covenant would pass by the angels and the gods, which are set there to their exaltation and glory in all things, as hath been sealed upon their heads, which glory shall be a fullness and a continuation of the seeds forever and ever. By the time Joseph Smith dictated this July 1843 revelation, approximately 7 legally married couples had each been sealed for eternity by priesthood authority, with Joseph Smith serving as an officiator in some of the sealings. In some instances, men were sealed to plural wives. In other instances, men were sealed by proxy to a deceased first wife as well as to a living wife, and in one case, the sealing of the couple took place following the plural marriage of their daughter. Plural marriage ran counter to both social customs and existing laws. Illinois law included an anti-bigamy statute. Such laws reflected a general antagonism in Anglo-European society toward polygamy. Christian theologians had long debated the practice of polygamy by biblical patriarchs, with some, like Martin Luther, defending it as divinely sanctioned. Others, such as John Calvin, argued that Abraham had erred in participating in the practice. While Americans in Joseph Smith's day still debated the legitimacy of polygamy as practiced by Abraham and other ancient patriarchs, a broad cultural consensus against any contemporary practice of plural marriage existed. Given the cultural opposition to polygamy, Latter-day Saints who were invited to participate in plural marriage generally required explanation and persuasion before they agreed to do so. Most of this instruction occurred in private conversations that were rarely recorded contemporaneously, although some participants summarized their discussions with Joseph Smith and others decades later in autobiographies and other reminiscent accounts. The authors of these reminiscences recorded that following these conversations, they sought and often received spiritual confirmation that the practice was inspired. On rare occasions, however, Joseph Smith cautiously wrote brief instructions and teachings regarding plural marriage. In a few known instances, Joseph Smith wrote letters to explain and defend plural marriage. Employing a common letter-writing convention of the time, Joseph Smith included explicit requests to burn such missives upon reading. Joseph Smith also dictated or wrote blessings and a revelation that obliquely addressed the doctrine and promised eternal rewards for those who entered the practice. In July 1842, he dictated a revelation for Newell K. Whitney, a close confidant and church leader, that provided instructions for the sealings of Joseph Smith to Whitney's daughter Sarah Ann. The following March, Joseph Smith composed two blessings, the first for Sarah Ann and the second for Joseph Kingsbury, who had agreed to be Sarah Ann's husband in a civil union. While the revelation featured her addressed Joseph Smith's specific situation with Emma Smith in July 1843, it also reflected these earlier teachings on plural marriage. According to Joseph Smith, biblical and divine teachings provided the impetus for the revelation. In June 1844, Joseph Smith stated that he received the revelation on inquiry about Matthew 22:30 in the New Testament, which reads, "For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven." The revelation featured here begins by acknowledging questions Joseph Smith had about the Old Testament practice of polygamy. In addition to citing biblical precedent, the featured revelation foregrounds several theological explanations for the practice, including the ultimate authority of God's law, the blessings and eternal rewards for those entering into the practice, and the consequences of not following God's law for those who had it revealed unto them, but did not obey it. Emma struggled with Joseph Smith's new marriages in the months leading up to July 1843. Since the beginning of 1843, Joseph Smith was sealed to at least 13 additional wives, most of whom were married to him without Emma's knowledge. Although details regarding Emma's reactions to Joseph Smith's practice of plural marriage prior to 1843 are scarce, she evidently came to accept the doctrine, albeit temporarily, by May of that year on the condition that she could choose the women to whom Joseph Smith would be sealed. That month, she selected Eliza and Emily Partridge, who were then ages 23 and 19 and living in the Smith household, as potential marriage partners to Joseph Smith. In fact, Joseph Smith had already been sealed to the sisters 2 months earlier. Joseph Smith and the Partridge sisters sought to avoid confrontation by repeating the marriages, with Emma's blessing as if for the first time. Likely during the same month, Emma suggested Joseph Smith marry Maria and Sarah Lawrence, ages 19 and 16 or 17, another pair of sisters who are living in the Smith household. However, Emily Partridge later testified that Emma became embittered soon after the Partridge sisters' second wedding ceremony. By the end of June, Joseph Smith's scribe William Clayton noted Emma was treating Joseph Smith coldly and badly and was disposed to be revenged on him, saying she thought that if he would indulge himself, she would too. Joseph Smith's late June arrest on charges stemming from the 1838 Missouri conflict and the subsequent habeas corpus proceedings before the Nauvoo Municipal Court delayed a potential reconciliation between Joseph Smith and Emma until mid-July. William Clayton later recalled that on the morning of 12th July, Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith came into the small office upstairs in the rear of the brick store and Clayton overheard them discussing plural marriage. The brothers' conversation turned to Emma's difficulties with the practice. Initially, Hiram was staunchly opposed to the practice of polygamy, which he had heard of through rumors, but in May 1843 he became both intellectually and spiritually convinced that the doctrine was inspired. Believing that Emma could be convinced of the doctrine, Hiram told Joseph Smith he could persuade her with the aid of a written revelation. "If you will write the revelation," Hiram told Joseph Smith, "I will take it and read it to Emma, and I believe I can convince her of its truth, and you will hereafter have peace." Joseph Smith expressed his doubts, to which Hiram replied, "The doctrine is so plain I can convince any reasonable man or woman of its truth, purity, and heavenly origin." Assenting to Hiram's urging, Joseph Smith dictated the revelation that morning to Clayton in Joseph Smith's office. Clayton recalled that Joseph Smith dictated the revelation on celestial marriage over the course of 3 hours, speaking slowly, sentence by sentence, as Clayton wrote. Following the initial creation of the document, he remembered, "Joseph requested me to read it slowly and carefully, which I did, and he then pronounced it correct." According to Clayton, the written revelation was only a portion of what could have been inscribed, but Joseph Smith explained that what was written was sufficient for the present. Clayton wrote in his journal that the original revelation comprised 10 pages. He also gave his own contemporaneous understanding of the revelation, explaining that it contained the order of the priesthood, including the designs in Moses, Abraham, David, and Solomon, having many wives and concubines, etc. The revelation framed both eternal and plural marriages as contracts ratified by the priesthood authority. Unlike civil marriages, sealings performed by priesthood authority did not have to end with the death of either party, but could persist into eternity. In addition, the revelation outlined regulations for plural marriages and the rights of first wives. The revelation did not distinguish between types of plural marriages. Nevertheless, reminiscent statements of some individuals who were sealed to Joseph Smith or who otherwise participated in plural marriage in this era suggest that early Latter-day Saints distinguished between sealings for time and eternity, involving relationships in this life and in the next life, and sealings for eternity alone, involving commitments only in the next life. Clayton documented in his journal that Joseph Smith and Hiram presented and read the revelation to Emma. The latter part of the revelation contained language directed to Emma, specifying severe consequences if she continued in her resistance to the doctrine and commanding her to forgive Joseph Smith so that she could be forgiven and so that God could bless her and multiply her and make her heart to rejoice. Hiram's confidence that he could convince Emma of the doctrine proved misplaced. According to Clayton, Emma did not believe a word of it and appeared very rebellious. Following the visit to Emma, Joseph Smith put the revelation in his pocket and left the office. For the next few days, the revelation was read by several of the authorities of the church. Clayton remembered that 2 or 3 days after the dictation of the revelation, Joseph Smith reported that Emma had teased and urgently entreated him for the privilege of destroying it, that he became so weary of her teasing and to get rid of her annoyance, he told her she might destroy it, and she had done so, but he had consented to her wish in this matter to pacify her. Elizabeth Ann Smith Whitney similarly reported that Emma burned the original, thinking she had destroyed the only written document upon the subject in existence. Unbeknownst to Emma, a copy of the revelation was made, either the evening of the 12th of July or the next day, before she had destroyed the original. After reviewing the revelation, Newell K. Whitney asked Joseph Smith whether a copy could be made, and Joseph Smith consented. Joseph Kingsbury, who was Whitney's former brother-in-law, a clerk in Joseph Smith's brick store, and legal husband to Whitney's daughter, Sarah Ann, carefully copied the revelation, after which the copy was compared against the original for accuracy. As scribe for the original dictation, Clayton affirmed in 1874 that the copy made by Joseph K. Kingsbury is a true and correct copy of the original in every respect. 4 days after he dictated this revelation, Joseph Smith preached a discourse on the law of the priesthood and described eternal marriage without mentioning plural marriage. Joseph Smith explained that a man must enter into an everlasting covenant with his wife in this world, or he will have no claim on her in the next. Although he did not explicitly acknowledge the existence of a new written revelation on the subject, he indicated that he could not reveal the fullness of these things until the temple is completed. While the closing lines of the revelation, reading therefore, let this suffice for the present, hint at additional instruction, no additional written revelations on the subject are known. Joseph Smith did, however, continue to develop some of the theological reasoning behind sealing, eternal progress, and other doctrine touched on in this revelation. After the revelation was inscribed, it circulated privately among a small group of individuals and was used to support the practice of plural marriage. For instance, in August 1843, Hiram Smith read the revelation to the Nauvoo High Council and then elaborated on its content for about an hour and testified it was true. Later in her life, Mercy Fielding Thompson testified that she not only saw and read the revelation, but it in her read the revelation, but had it in her possession for quite a little while, or 4 or 5 days, after which she returned it to Hiram Smith. Not everyone close to Joseph Smith immediately saw the copy of the revelation. Willard Richards wrote to Brigham Young and spoke of a new revelation, though he stated that he had not yet seen it. While knowledge of the revelation and plural marriage remained guarded, Joseph Smith began teaching the doctrine of eternal marriage publicly. In early July 1844, Jacob Scott wrote to his daughter Mary about possibilities he saw as exciting. Several revelations of good utility and uncommon interest have been lately communicated to Joseph and the church. One is that all marriage contracts or covenants are to be everlasting, that is, for both time and eternity. Scott continued explaining that if a man desires to be married to his deceased wife, a sister in the church stands as proxy or as a representative of the deceased in attending to the marriage ceremony. Personalizing the news, Scott, who was called to serve a mission in Ireland, told his daughter, "I intend to be married to the wife of my youth before I go." Though the revelation stipulated dire consequences for those who did not obey the law after having it revealed unto them, some Latter-day Saint women and men who were introduced to the doctrine of plural marriage delayed entering into the practice, declined specific marriage proposals, or rejected outright the doctrine itself. Some of them remained in the church in Nauvoo. Joseph Smith's own entrance into new plural marriages apparently decreased dramatically after he dictated this revelation. He entered only 2 new marriages with known dates, though he or others appointed to do so continued to seal other plural and monogamous couples through the end of his life. For the remainder of the 19th century, the Kingsbury copy of the Revelation provided the textual support for Latter-day Saint belief in eternal marriage and the practice of plural marriage. All other extant versions are based on the Kingsbury copy. As the earliest extant version of the 12th July 1843 Revelation, it is featured here. Okay, so then it goes through the Revelation, and I kind of like this resource as well when we're going through the Doctrine and Covenants, because their footnotes are different. If you click on here, I don't know, some of them have like just different things than the scriptures do, so kind of fun to read. Okay, so let's go into the Gospel Topics essays, and I'm reading these because there's no audio versions available. There's audio versions of DNC 132, and there's audio versions of the Saints where you could just listen to it. I like to listen to things while I drive around, and that's why I make these videos, to make it easy for people. So Gospel Topics essay says, Plural Marriage and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Latter-day Saints believe that the marriage of one man and one woman is the Lord's standing law of marriage. In biblical times, the Lord commanded some to practice plural marriage, the marriage of one man and more than one woman. By revelation, the Lord commanded Joseph Smith to institute the practice of plural marriage among church members in the early 1840s. For more than a half century, plural marriage was practiced by some Latter-day Saints under the direction of the church president. Latter-day Saints do not understand all of God's purposes in instituting through his prophets the practice of plural marriage. The Book of Mormon identifies one reason for God to command it: to increase the number of children born in the gospel covenant in order to raise up seed unto the Lord. Plural marriage did result in the birth of large numbers of children within faithful Latter-day Saint homes. It also shaped 19th century Mormon society in many ways. Marriage became available to virtually all who desired it. Per capita inequality of wealth was diminished as economically disadvantaged women married into more financially stable households, and ethnic intermarriages were increased, which helped to unite a diverse immigration population. Plural marriage also helped create and strengthen a sense of cohesion and group identification among the Latter-day Saints. Church members came to see themselves as a peculiar people, covenant-bound to carry out the commands of God despite outside opposition. The beginnings of plural marriage in the church. Polygamy had been permitted for millennia in many cultures and religions, but with few exceptions, it was rejected in Western cultures. In Joseph Smith's time, monogamy was the only legal form of marriage in the United States. The revelation on plural marriage, recorded in Doctrine and Covenants 132, emerged partly from Joseph Smith's study of the Old Testament in 1831. Latter-day Saints understood that they were living in the latter days, in what the Revelations call the dispensation of the fullness of times. Ancient principles, such as prophets, priesthood, and temples, would be restored to the earth. Plural marriage, practiced by ancient patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses, was one of those ancient principles. The same revelation that taught of plural marriage was embedded within a revelation about eternal marriage, the teaching that marriage could last beyond death. Monogamous and plural marriages performed by priesthood power could seal loved ones to each other for eternity on condition of righteousness. The revelation on marriage states general principles. It did not explain how to implement plural marriage in all its particulars. In Nauvoo, Joseph Smith married additional wives and authorized other Latter-day Saints to practice plural marriage. The practice was introduced carefully and incrementally, and participants vowed to keep their participation confidential, anticipating a time when husbands and wives could acknowledge one another publicly. I'll come back and I'll read this later. Plural marriages and families in 19th century Utah. Between 1852 and 1890, Latter-day Saints openly practiced plural marriage. Most plural families lived in Utah. Women and men who lived within plural marriage attested to challenges and difficulties, but also to the love and joy they found within their families. They believed it was a commandment of God at that time, and that obedience would bring great blessings to them and their posterity. Church leaders taught that participants in plural marriages should seek to develop a generous spirit of unselfishness and the pure love of Christ for everyone involved. Although some leaders had large polygamous families, 2/3 of polygamous men had only 2 wives at a time. Church leaders recognized that plural marriages could be particularly difficult for women. Divorce was therefore available to women who were unhappy in their marriages. Remarriage was also readily available. Women sometimes married at young ages in the first decade of Utah settlement, which was typical of women living in frontier areas at the time. At its peak, in 1857, perhaps 1/2 of all Utah Latter-day Saints experienced plural marriage as a husband, wife, or child. The percentage of those involved in plural marriage steadily declined over the next 3 decades. During the years that plural marriage was publicly taught, not all Latter-day Saints were expected to live the principle, though all were expected to accept it as a revelation from God. Indeed, this system of marriage could not have been universal due to the ratio of men to women. Women were free to choose their spouses, whether to enter into a polygamous or monogamous union, or whether to marry at all. Some men entered plural marriages because they were asked to do so by church leaders, while others initiated the processes themselves. All were required to obtain the approval of church leaders before entering a plural marriage. Anti-polygamy legislation and the end of plural marriage. Beginning in 1862, the U.S. government passed laws against the practice of plural marriage. After the U.S. Supreme Court found the anti-polygamy laws to be constitutional in 1879, federal officials began prosecuting polygamous husbands and wives during the 1880s, believing these laws to be unjust. Latter-day Saints engaged in civil disobedience by continuing to practice plural marriage and by attempting to avoid arrest, by moving to the homes of friends or family, or by hiding under assumed names. When convicted, they paid fines and submitted to jail time. One of the anti-polygamy laws permitted the U.S. government to seize church property. Federal officers soon threatened to take Latter-day Saint temples. The work of salvation for both the living and the dead was now in jeopardy. In September 1890, Church President Wilford Woodruff felt inspired to issue the Manifesto. Inasmuch as laws have been enacted by Congress forbidding plural marriages, President Woodruff explained, I hereby declare my intention to submit to those laws and to use my influence with the members of the church over which I preside to have them do likewise. The full implications of the document were not apparent at first. The Lord's way is to speak line upon line, here a little, there a little, like the beginning of plural marriage in the church. The end of the practice was gradual and incremental, a process filled with difficulties and uncertainties. The Manifesto declared President Woodruff's intention to submit to the laws of the United States, and new plural marriages within that jurisdiction largely came to an end, but a small number of plural marriages continued to be performed in Mexico and Canada under the sanction of some church leaders. As a rule, these marriages were not promoted by church leaders and were difficult to get approved. Either one or both of the spouses who entered into these unions typically had to agree to remain in Canada or Mexico. On an exceptional basis, a small number of plural marriages were performed within the United States between the years of 1890 and 1904. The church's role in these marriages became a subject of intense public debate after Reed Smoot, an apostle, was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1903. At the April 1904 General Conference, Church President Joseph F. Smith issued a forceful statement known as the Second Manifesto, making new plural marriages punishable by excommunication. Since President Smith's day, church presidents have repeatedly emphasized that the church and its members are no longer authorized to enter into plural marriage and have underscored the sincerity of their words by urging local leaders to bring non-compliant members before church disciplinary councils. Conclusion. Plural marriage was among the most challenging aspect of the Restoration. For many who practiced it, plural marriage was a trial of faith. It violated both cultural and legal norms, leading to persecution and revilement. Despite these hardships, plural marriage benefited the church in innumerable ways. Through the lineage of these 19th century saints have come many Latter-day Saints who have been faithful to their gospel covenants as righteous mothers and fathers. Loyal disciples of Jesus Christ, devoted church members, leaders, and missionaries, and good citizens and prominent public officials. Modern Latter-day Saints honor and respect these faithful pioneers who gave so much for their faith, families, and community. Okay. And if you want more, keep listening. We're going to go into the beginnings of plural marriage. Let's see, was that the right section? The beginnings of plural marriage. Yes, so we'll read this next. Plural marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo. Latter-day Saints believe that monogamy, the marriage of one man and one woman, is the Lord's standing law of marriage. In biblical times, the Lord commanded some of his people to practice plural marriage, the marriage of one man and more than one woman. Some early members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints also received and obeyed this commandment given through God's prophets. Some of this might repeat a little bit from that previous one. It was a summary of this document here, so there's going to be some overlap. After receiving a revelation commanding him to practice plural marriage, Joseph Smith married multiple wives and introduced the practice to close associates. This principle was among the most challenging aspect of the Restoration, for Joseph personally and for the other church members. Plural marriage tested faith and provoked controversy and opposition. Few Latter-day Saints initially welcomed the restoration of a biblical practice entirely foreign to their sensibilities, but many later testified of powerful spiritual experiences that helped them overcome their hesitation and gave them courage to accept this practice. Although the Lord commanded the adoption and later the cessation of plural marriage in the latter days, he did not give exact instructions on how to obey the commandment. Significant social and cultural changes often included misunderstandings and difficulties. Church leaders and members experienced these challenges as they heeded the command to practice plural marriage, and again later as they worked to discontinue it after President Wilford Woodruff issued an inspired statement known as the Manifesto in 1890, which led to the end of plural marriage in the church. Through it all, church leaders and members sought to follow God's will. Many details about the early practice of plural marriage are unknown. Plural marriage was introduced among the early saints incrementally, and participants were asked to keep their actions confidential. They did not discuss their experiences publicly or in writing until after the Latter-day Saints had moved to Utah and church leaders had publicly acknowledged the practice. The historical record of early plural marriage is therefore thin. Few records of the time provide details, and later reminiscences are not always reliable. Some ambiguity will always accompany our knowledge about this issue. Like the participants, we see through a glass darkly and are asked to walk by faith. The beginnings of plural marriage in the church. The revelation on plural marriage was not written down until 1843, but its early verses suggest that part of it emerged from Joseph Smith's study of the Old Testament in 1831. People who knew Joseph well later stated he received the revelation about that time. The revelation recorded in Doctrine and Covenants 132 states that Joseph prayed to know why God justified Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, David, and Solomon, and having many wives. The Lord responded that he had commanded them to enter into the practice. Latter-day Saints understood that they were living in the latter days in what the Revelations called the dispensation of the fullness of times. Ancient principles, such as prophets, priesthood, and temples, would be restored to the earth. Plural marriage was one of those ancient principles. Polygamy had been permitted for millennia in many cultures and religions, but with few exceptions was rejected in Western cultures. In Joseph Smith's time, monogamy was the only legal form of marriage in the United States. Joseph knew the practice of plural marriage would stir up public ire. After receiving the commandment, he taught a few associates about it, but he did not spread this teaching widely in the 1830s. When God commands a difficult task, he sometimes sends additional messengers to encourage his people to obey. Consistent with this pattern, Joseph told associates that an angel appeared to him 3 times between 1834 and 1842 and commanded him to proceed with plural marriage when he hesitated to move forward. During the third and final appearance, the angel came with a drawn sword, threatening Joseph with destruction unless he went forward and obeyed the commandment fully. Fragmentary evidence suggests that Joseph Smith acted on the angel's first command by marrying a plural wife, Fanny Alger, in Kirtland, Ohio in the mid-1830s. Several Latter-day Saints who had lived in Kirtland reported decades later that Joseph Smith had married Alger, who lived and worked in the Smith household after he had obtained her consent and that of her parents. Little is known about this marriage, and nothing is known about the conversations between Joseph and Emma regarding Alger. After the marriage with Alger ended in separation, Joseph seems to have set the subject of plural marriage aside until after the church moved to Nauvoo, Illinois. Plural marriage and eternal marriage. The same revelation that taught of plural marriage was part of a larger revelation given to Joseph Smith, that marriage could last beyond death and that eternal marriage was essential to inheriting the fullness that God desires for his children. As early as 1840, Joseph Smith privately taught Apostle Parley P. Pratt that the heavenly order allowed Pratt and his wife to be together for time and all eternity. Joseph also taught that men like Pratt, who had remarried following the death of his first wife, could be married or sealed to their wives for eternity under the proper conditions. The sealing of husband and wife for eternity made possible by the restoration of priesthood keys and ordinances. On April 3, 1836, the Old Testament prophet Elijah appeared to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery in the Kirtland Temple and restored the priesthood keys necessary to perform ordinances for the living and the dead, including sealing families together. Marriages performed by priesthood authority could link loved ones to each other for eternity, on condition of righteousness. Marriages performed without this authority would end at death. Marriage performed by priesthood authority meant that the procreation of children and perpetuation of families would continue in the eternities. Joseph Smith's revelation on marriage declared that the continuation of the seeds forever and ever helped to fulfill God's purposes for his children. This promise was given to all couples who were married by priesthood authority and were faithful to their covenants. Plural marriage in Nauvoo. For much of Western history, family interest, economic, political, and social considerations dominated the choice of spouse. Parents had the power to arrange marriages or forestall unions of which they disapproved. By the late 1700s, romance and personal choice began to rival these traditional motives and practices. By Joseph Smith's time, many couples insisted on marrying for love, as he and Emma did when they eloped against her parents' wishes. Latter-day Saints' motives for plural marriage were often more religious than economic or romantic. Besides the desire to be obedient, a strong incentive was the hope of living in God's presence with family members. In the revelation on marriage, the Lord promised participants crowns of eternal lives and exaltation in the eternal worlds. Men and women, parents and children, ancestors and progeny were to be sealed to each other, their commitment lasting into the eternities, consistent with Jesus' promise that priesthood ordinances performed on earth could be bound in heaven. The first plural marriage in Nauvoo took place when Louisa Beeman and Joseph Smith were sealed in April 1841. Joseph married many additional wives and authorized other Latter-day Saints to practice plural marriage. The practice spread slowly at first. By June 1844, when Joseph died, approximately 29 men and 50 women had entered into plural marriage, in addition to Joseph and his wives. When the Saints entered the Salt Lake Valley in 1847, at least 196 men and 521 women had entered into plural marriage. Participants in these early plural marriages pledged to keep their involvement confidential, though they anticipated a time when the practice would be publicly acknowledged. Nevertheless, rumors spread. A few men unscrupulously used these rumors to seduce women to join them in an unauthorized practice sometimes referred to as spiritual wifery. When this was discovered, the men were cut off from the church. The rumors prompted members to issue carefully worded denials that denounced spiritual wifery and polygamy, but were silent about what Joseph Smith and others saw as divinely mandated celestial plural marriage. The statements emphasized that the church practiced no marital law other than monogamy, while implicitly leaving open the possibility that individuals, under the direction of God's living prophet, might do so. Joseph Smith and plural marriage. During the era in which plural marriage was practiced, Latter-day Saints distinguished between sealings for time and eternity and sealings for eternity only. Sealings for time and eternity included commitments and relationships during this life, generally including the possibility of sexual relations. Eternity-only sealings indicated relationships in the next life alone. Evidence indicates that Joseph Smith participated in both types of sealings. The exact number of women to whom he was sealed in his lifetime is unknown because the evidence is fragmentary. Some of the women who were sealed to Joseph Smith later testified that their marriages were for time and eternity, while others indicated that their relationships were for eternity alone. Most of those sealed to Joseph Smith were born between 20 and 40 Most of those sealed to Joseph Smith were between 20 and 40 years of age at the time of their sealing to him. The oldest, Fanny Young, was 56 years old. The youngest was Helen Mar Kimball, daughter of Joseph's close friends Heber C. and Valiant Murray Kimball, who was sealed to Joseph Smith several months before her 15th birthday. Marriage at such an age, inappropriate by today's standards, was legal in that era, and some women married in their mid-teens. Helen Mar Kimball spoke of her sealing to Joseph as being for eternity alone, suggesting that the relationship did not involve sexual relations. After Joseph's death, Helen remarried and became an articulate defender of him and of plural marriage. Following his marriage to Louisa Beeman and before he married other single women, Joseph Smith was sealed to a number of women who were already married. Neither of these women nor Joseph explained much about these sealings, though several women said they were for eternity alone. Other women left no records, making it unknown whether their sealings were for time and eternity or were for eternity alone. There are several possible explanations for this practice. These sealings may have provided a way to create an eternal bond or link between Joseph's family and other families within the church. These ties extended both vertically from parent to child and horizontally from one family to another. Today, such eternal bonds are achieved through the temple marriages of individuals who are also sealed to their own birth families, in this way linking families together. Joseph Smith's sealings to women already married may have been an early version of linking one's family to another. In Nauvoo, most, if not all, of the first husbands seem to have continued living in the same household with their wives during Joseph's lifetime, and complaints about these sealings with Joseph Smith are virtually absent from the documentary record. These sealings may have been explained by Joseph's reluctance to enter plural marriage because of the sorrow it would bring to his wife Emma. He may have believed that sealings to married women would comply with the Lord's command without requiring him to have normal marriage relationships. This could explain why, according to Lorenzo Snow, the angel reprimanded Joseph for having demurred on plural marriage even after he had entered into the practice. After this rebuke, according to this interpretation, Joseph returned primarily to sealing with single women. Another possibility is that in an era when lifespans were shorter than they are today, faithful women felt an urgency to be sealed by priesthood authority. Several of these women were married either to non-Mormons or former Mormons, and more than one of the women later expressed unhappiness in their present marriages. Living in a time when divorce was difficult to obtain, these women may have believed a sealing to Joseph Smith would give them blessings they might not otherwise receive in the next life. The women who united with Joseph Smith in plural marriage risked reputation and self-respect in being associated with a principle so foreign to their culture and so easily misunderstood by others. I made a great sacrifice than to give my life. I made a greater sacrifice than to give my life, said Zena Huntington Jacobs, for I never anticipated again to be looked upon as an honorable woman. Nevertheless, she wrote, I searched the Scripture, and by humble prayer to my Heavenly Father I obtained a testimony for myself. After Joseph's death, most of the women sealed to him moved to Utah with the saints, remained faithful church members, and defended plural marriage and Joseph. Joseph and Emma. Plural marriage was difficult for all involved. For Joseph Smith's wife, Emma, it was an excruciating ordeal. Records of Emma's reactions to plural marriage are sparse. She left no first-hand accounts, making it impossible to reconstruct her thoughts. Joseph and Emma loved and respected each other deeply. After he had entered into plural marriage, he poured out his feelings in his journal for his beloved Emma, whom he described as undaunted, firm, and unwavering, unchangeable, affectionate Emma. After Joseph's death, Emma kept a lock of his hair in a locket she wore around her neck. Emma approved, at least for a time, of 4 of Joseph Smith's plural marriages in Nauvoo, and she accepted all 4 of those wives into her household. She may have approved of other marriages as well, but Emma likely did not know about all of Joseph's sealings. She vacillated in her view of plural marriage, at some points supporting it and at other times denouncing it. In the summer of 1843, Joseph Smith dictated the Revelation on Marriage, a lengthy and complex text containing both glorious promises and stern warnings, some directed at Emma. The Revelation instructed women and men that they must obey God's law and commands in order to receive the fullness of his glory. The Revelation on Marriage required that a wife gave her consent before her husband could enter into plural marriage. Nevertheless, toward the end of the Revelation, the Lord said that if the first wife received not this law, the command to practice plural marriage, the husband would be exempt from the law of Sarah, presumably the requirement that the husband gain the consent of the first wife before marrying additional women. After Emma opposed plural marriage, Joseph was placed in an agonizing dilemma, forced to choose between the will of God and the will of his beloved Emma. He may have thought Emma's rejection of plural marriage exempted him from the law of Sarah. Her decision to receive not this law permitted him to marry additional wives without her consent. Because of Joseph's early death and Emma's decision to remain in Nauvoo and not discuss plural marriage after the church moved west, many aspects of their story remain known only to the two of them. Trial and spiritual witness. Years later in Utah, participants in Nauvoo, Plural Marriage discussed their motives for entering into the practice. God declared in the Book of Mormon that monogamy was the standard. At times, however, he commanded plural marriage so his people could raise up seed unto him. Plural marriage did result in an increased number of children born to believing parents. Some saints also saw plural marriage as a redemptive process of sacrifice and spiritual refinement. According to Helen Mar Kimball, Joseph Smith stated that the practice of this principle would be the hardest trial the saints would ever have to test their faith. Though it was one of the severest trials in her life, she testified that it had also been one of the greatest blessings. Her father, Heber C. Kimball, agreed. I never felt more sorrowful, he said, of the moment he learned of plural marriage in 1841. I wept days. I had a good wife. I was satisfied. The decision to accept such a wrenching trial usually came only after earnest prayer and intense soul-searching. Brigham Young said that upon learning of plural marriage, it was the first time in my life that I had desired the grave. I had to pray unceasingly, he said. I had to exercise faith, and the Lord revealed to me the truth of it, and that satisfied me. Heber C. Kimball found comfort only after his wife, Valiant, had a visionary experience attesting to the righteousness of plural marriage. She told me, Valiant's daughter later recalled, she never saw so happy a man as father was when she described the vision and told him she was satisfied and knew it was from God. Lucy Walker recalled her inner turmoil when Joseph Smith invited her to become his wife. Every feeling of my soul revolted against it, she wrote. Yet after several restless nights, on her knees in prayer, she found relief in her room, filled with a holy influence akin to brilliant sunshine. She said, my soul was filled with a calm, sweet peace that I never knew, and supreme happiness took possession of my whole being. Not all had such experiences. Some Latter-day Saints rejected the principle of plural marriage and left the church, while others declined to enter the practice but remained faithful. Nevertheless, for many women and men, initial revulsion and anguish was followed by struggle, resolution, and ultimately, light and peace. Sacred experiences enabled the saints to move forward in faith. Conclusion. The challenge of introducing a principle as controversial as plural marriage is almost impossible to overstate. A spiritual witness of its truthfulness allowed Joseph Smith and other Latter-day Saints to accept this principle. Difficult as it was, the introduction of plural marriage in Nauvoo did indeed raise up seed unto God. A substantial number of today's members descend through faithful Latter-day Saints who practice plural marriage. Church members no longer practice plural marriage. Consistent with Joseph Smith's teachings, the church permits a man whose wife has died to be sealed to another woman when he remarries. Moreover, members are permitted to perform ordinances on behalf of deceased men and women who marry more than once on earth, sealing them to all their spouses to whom they were legally married. The precise nature of these relationships in the next life is not known, and many family relationships will be sorted out in the life to come. Latter-day Saints are encouraged to trust in our wise Heavenly Father who loves His children and does all things for their growth and salvation. So now we'll go back, and we read the first one, the beginnings of plural marriage. Now we'll read more about plural marriage families in Utah. In early Utah. So it says, the Bible and the Book of Mormon teach that the marriage of one man to one woman is God's standard, except at specific periods when he has declared otherwise. In accordance with a revelation to Joseph Smith, the practice of plural marriage, the marriage of one man to two or more women, was instituted among members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the early 1840s. Thereafter, for more than half a century, plural marriage was practiced by some Latter-day Saints. Only the church president held the keys authorizing the performance of new plural marriages. In 1890, the Lord inspired Church President Wilford Woodruff to issue a statement that led to the end of the practice of plural marriage in the church. In this statement, known as the Manifesto, President Woodruff declared his intention to abide by U.S. law forbidding plural marriage and to use his influence to convince members of the church to do likewise. After the manifesto, monogamy was advocated in the church, both over the pulpit and through the press. On an occasional basis, some new plural marriages were performed between 1890 and 1904, especially in Mexico and Canada, outside the jurisdiction of U.S. law. A small number of plural marriages were performed within the United States during those years. In 1904, the church strictly prohibited new plural marriages. Today, any person who practices plural marriage cannot become or remain a member of the church. This essay primarily addresses plural marriage as practiced by the Latter-day Saints between 1847 and 1890, following their exodus to the U.S. West and before the Manifesto. Latter-day Saints do not understand all of God's purposes for instituting, through his prophets, the practice of plural marriage during the 19th century. The Book of Mormon identifies one reason for God to command it, to increase the number of children born in the gospel covenant in order to raise up seed unto the Lord. Plural marriage did result in the birth of large numbers of children within faithful Latter-day Saint homes. It also shaped 19th century Mormon society in other ways. Marriage became available to virtually all who desired it. Per capita inequality of wealth was diminished as economically disadvantaged women married into more financially stable households, and ethnic intermarriages were increased, which helped to unite a diverse immigrant population. Plural marriage also helped create and strengthen a sense of cohesion and group identification among Latter-day Saints. Church members came to see themselves as a peculiar people, covenant-bound, to carry out the commands of God despite outside opposition, willing to endure ostracism for their principles. For these early Latter-day Saints, plural marriage was a religious principle that required personal sacrifice. Accounts left by men and women who practiced plural marriage attest to the challenges and difficulties they experienced, such as financial difficulty, interpersonal strife, and some wives longing for the sustained companionship of their husbands. But accounts also record the love and joy many found within their families. They believed it was a commandment of God at that time, and that obedience would bring great blessings to them and their posterity, both on earth and in the life to come. While there was much love, tenderness, and affection within many plural marriages, the practice was generally based more on religious belief than on romantic love. Church leaders taught that participants in plural marriage should seek to develop a generous spirit of unselfishness and the pure love of Christ for everyone involved. During the years that plural marriage was publicly taught, all Latter-day Saints were expected to accept the principle as a revelation from God. Not all, however, were expected to live it. Indeed, this system of marriage could not have been universal due to the ratio of men to women. Church leaders viewed plural marriage as a command to the church generally, while recognizing that individuals who did not enter the practice could still stand approved of God. Women were free to choose their spouses, whether to enter into a polygamous or monogamous union, or whether to marry at all. Some men entered a plural marriage because they were asked to do so by church leaders, while others initiated the process themselves. All were required to obtain the approval of church leaders before entering a plural marriage. The passage of time shaped the experience of life within plural marriage. Virtually all of those practicing in the earliest years had to overcome their own prejudice against plural marriage and adjust to life in polygamous families. The task of pioneering a semi-arid land during the middle decades of the 19th century added to the challenges of families who were learning to practice the principle of plural marriage. Where the family lived, whether in Salt Lake City with its multiple social and cultural opportunities, or the rural hinterlands, where such opportunities were fewer in number, made a difference in how plural marriage was experienced. It is therefore difficult to accurately generalize about the experience of all plural marriages. Still, some patterns are discernible, and they correct some myths. Although some leaders had large polygamous families, 2/3 of polygamous men had only 2 wives at a time. Church leaders recognized that plural marriages could be particularly difficult for women. Divorce was therefore available to women who were unhappy in their marriages. Remarriage was also readily available. Women did marry at fairly young ages in the first decade of Utah settlement. age 16 or 17, or infrequently younger, which was typical of women living in frontier areas at the time. As in other places, women married at older ages as the society matured. Almost all women married, and so did a large percentage of men. In fact, it appears that a large percentage of men in Utah married than elsewhere in the United States at the time. Probably half of those living in Utah Territory in 1857 experienced life in a polygamous family as a husband, wife, or child at some time during their lives. By 1870, 25 to 30% of the population lived in a polygamous household, and it appears that the percentage continues to decrease over the next 20 years. The experience of plural marriage toward the end of the 19th century was substantially different from that of earlier decades. Beginning in 1862, the U.S. government passed laws against the practice of plural marriage. Outside opponents mounted a campaign against the practice, stating that they hoped to protect Mormon women and American civilization. For their part, many Latter-day Saint women publicly defended the practice of plural marriage, arguing in statements that they were willing participants. After the U.S. Supreme Court found the anti-polygamy laws to be constitutional in 1879, federal officials began prosecuting polygamous husbands and wives during the 1880s. Believing these laws to be unjust, Latter-day Saints engaged in civil disobedience by continuing to practice plural marriage and by attempting to avoid arrest. When convicted, they paid fines and submitted to jail time. To help their husbands avoid prosecution, plural wives often separated into different households or went into hiding under assumed names, particularly when pregnant or after giving birth. By 1890, when President Woodruff's manifesto lifted the command to practice plural marriage, Mormon society had developed a strong, loyal core of members, mostly made up of immigrants from Europe and the eastern United States. But the demographic makeup of the worldwide church membership had begun to change. Beginning in the 1890s, converts outside the United States were asked to build up the church in their homelands rather than to move to Utah. In subsequent decades, Latter-day Saints migrated away from the Great Basin to pursue new opportunities. Plural marriage had never been encouraged. Plural marriage had never been encouraged outside of concentrated populations of Latter-day Saints. Especially in these newly formed congregations outside of Utah, monogamous families became central to religious worship and learning. As the church grew and spread beyond the American West, the monogamous nuclear family was well suited to an increasingly mobile and dispersed membership. For many who practiced it, plural marriage was a significant sacrifice. Despite the hardships some experienced, the faithfulness of those who practice plural marriage continues to benefit the church in innumerable ways. Through the lineage of these 19th century saints have come many Latter-day Saints who have been faithful to their gospel covenants as righteous mothers and fathers, loyal disciples of Jesus Christ, and devoted church members, leaders, and missionaries. Although members of the contemporary church are forbidden to practice plural marriage, modern Latter-day Saints honor and respect these pioneers who gave so much for their faith, families, and community. All right, I'm losing my voice. We got one more to go. The Manifesto and the End of Plural Marriage. Wow, there's a lot here. All right, let's do it. For much of the 19th century, a significant number of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints practiced plural marriage, the marriage of one man to more than one woman. The beginning and end of the practice were directed by revelation through God's prophets. The initial command to practice plural marriage came through Joseph Smith, the founding prophet and president of the church. In 1890, President Wilford Woodruff issued the manifesto, which led to the end of plural marriage in the church. The end of plural marriage required great faith and sometimes complicated, painful, and intensely personal decisions on the part of individual members and church leaders. Like the beginning of plural marriage in the church, the end of the practice was a process rather than a single event. Revelation came line upon line, precept upon precept. Anti-polygamy laws and civil disobedience. For half a century, beginning in the early 1840s, church members viewed plural marriage as a commandment from God, an imperative that helped raise up a righteous posterity unto the Lord. Though not all church members were expected to enter into plural marriage, those who did so believed they would be blessed for their participation. Between the 1850s and the 1880s, many Latter-day Saints lived in plural families as husbands, wives, or children. In many parts of the world, polygamy was socially acceptable and legally permissible. But in the United States, most people thought that the practice was morally wrong. These objections led to legislative efforts to end polygamy. Beginning in 1862, the U.S. government passed a series of laws designed to force Latter-day Saints to relinquish plural marriage. In the face of these measures, Latter-day Saints maintained that plural marriage was a religious principle protected under the U.S. Constitution. The church mounted a vigorous legal defense all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. In Reynolds v. the United States in 1879, the Supreme Court ruled against the Latter-day Saints. Religious belief was protected by law. Religious practice was not. According to the court's opinion, marriage was a civil contract regulated by the state. Monogamy was the only form of marriage sanctioned by the state. Polygamy, the court explained, has always been odious among the northern and western nations of Europe. Latter-day Saints sincerely desired to be loyal citizens of the United States, which they considered a divinely founded nation. But they also accepted plural marriage as a commandment from God and believed that the court was unjustly depriving them of their right to follow God's commands. Confronted with these contradictory allegations, church leaders encouraged members to obey God rather than man. Many Latter-day Saints embarked on a course of civil disobedience during the 1880s by continuing to live in plural marriage and to enter into new plural marriages. The federal government responded by enacting ever more punishing legislation. Between 1850 and 1896, Utah was a territory of the U.S. government, which meant that federal officials in Washington, D.C. exercised great control over local matters. In 1882, the U.S. Congress passed the Edmunds Act, which made unlawful cohabitation, interpreted as a man living with more than one wife, punishable by 6 months of imprisonment and a $300 fine. In 1887, Congress passed the Edmunds-Tucker Act to punish the church itself, not just its members. The act dissolved the corporation of the church and directed that all church property over $50,000 be forfeited to the government. This government opposition strengthened the saints' resolve to resist what they deemed to be unjust laws. Polygamous men went into hiding, sometimes for years at a time, moving from house to house and staying with friends and relatives. Others assumed aliases and moved to out-of-the-way places in southern Utah, Arizona, Canada, and Mexico. Many escaped prosecution. Many others were arrested. They pled guilty and submitted to fines and imprisonment. This anti-polygamy campaign created great disruption in Mormon communities. The departure of husbands left wives and children to tend farms and businesses, causing incomes to drop and an economic recession to set in. The campaign also strained families. New plural wives had to live apart from their husbands, their confidential marriages known only to a few. Pregnant women often chose to go into hiding, at times in remote locales, rather than risk being subpoenaed to testify in court against their husbands. Children lived in fear that their families would be broken up, or that they would be forced to testify against their parents. Some children went into hiding and lived under assumed names. Despite countless difficulties, many Latter-day Saints were convinced that the anti-polygamy campaign was useful in accomplishing God's purposes. They testified that God was humbling and purifying his covenant people as he had done in ages past. Myron Tanner, a bishop in Provo, Utah, felt that he had the hand of oppression laid on the parents, is doing more to convince our children of the truth of Mormonism than anything else could have done. Incarceration for conscience sake proved edifying for many. George Q. Cannon, a counselor in the first presidency, emerged from his 5 months in the Utah penitentiary rejuvenated. "My cell has seemed a heavenly place, and I feel that angels have been there," he wrote. The church completed and dedicated 2 temples during the anti-polygamy campaign, a remarkable achievement, but as federal pressure intensified, many essential aspects of church government were severely curtailed, and civil disobedience looked increasingly untenable as a long-term solution. Between 1885 In 1889, most apostles and stake presidents were in hiding or in prison. After federal agents began seizing church property in accordance with the Edmunds-Tucker legislation, management of the church became more difficult. The Manifesto. After 2 decades of seeking either to negotiate a change in the law or avoid its disastrous consequences, church leaders began to investigate alternative responses. In 1885 and 86, they established settlements in Mexico and Canada, outside the jurisdiction of U.S. law, where polygamous families could live peaceably. Hoping that a moderation in their position would lead to a reduction in hostilities, church leaders advised plural husbands to live openly with only one of their wives and advocate that plural marriage not be taught publicly. In 1889, church authorities prohibited the performance of new plural marriages in Utah. Church leaders prayerfully sought guidance from the Lord and struggled to understand what they should do. Both President John Taylor and President Wilford Woodruff felt the Lord directing them to stay the course and not renounce plural marriage. This inspiration came when paths for legal redress were still open. The last of the paths closed in May 1890 when the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the Edmunds-Tucker Act, allowing the confiscation of church property to proceed. President Woodruff saw that the church's temples and its ordinances were now at risk. Burdened by this threat, he prayed intensely over the matter. The Lord showed me by vision and revelation, he later said, exactly what would take place if we did not stop this practice, referring to plural marriage. All the temples would go out of our hands. God has told me exactly what to do and what the result would be if we did not do it. On September 25, 1890, President Woodruff wrote in his journal that he was under the necessity of acting on the temporal salvation of the church. He stated, after praying to the Lord and feeling inspired by his Spirit, I have issued a proclamation. This proclamation, now published in the Doctrine and Covenants as Official Declaration 1, was released to the public on September 25th and became known as the Manifesto. The Manifesto was carefully worded to address the immediate conflict with the U.S. government. We are not teaching polygamy or plural marriage, nor permitting any person to enter into its practice, President Woodruff said. Inasmuch as laws have been enacted by Congress forbidding plural marriages, which laws have been pronounced constitutional by the court of last resort, I hereby declare my intention to submit to those laws and to use my influence with the members of the church over which I preside to have them do likewise. The members of the Quorum of the 12 varied in their reactions to the Manifesto. Franklin D. Richards was sure it was the work of the Lord. Francis M. Lyman said that he had endorsed the Manifesto fully when he had first heard it. Not all of the 12 accepted the document immediately. John W. Taylor said he did not yet feel quite right about it at first. John Henry Smith candidly admitted that the Manifesto had disturbed his feelings very much, and that he was still somewhat at sea regarding it. Within a week, however, all members of the 12 voted to sustain the Manifesto. The Manifesto was formally presented to the church at the semi-annual General Conference held in the Salt Lake Tabernacle in October 1890. On Monday, October 6th, Orson F. Whitney, a Salt Lake City bishop, stood at the pulpit and read the Articles of Faith, which included the line that Latter-day Saints believe in obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law. These articles were sustained by uplifted hands. Whitney then read the Manifesto, and Lorenzo Snow, president of the Quorum of the 12, moved that the document be accepted as authoritative and binding. The assembly was then asked to vote on this motion. The Deseret News reported that the vote was unanimous. Most voted in favor, though some abstained from voting. Rank-and-file Latter-day Saints accepted the Manifesto with various degrees of reservation. Many were not ready for plural marriage to come to an end. General Relief Society President Zena D.H. Young, writing in her journal on the day of the Manifesto was presented to the church, captured the anguish of the moment. Today the hearts of all were tried, but looked to God and submitted. The Manifesto prompted uncertainty about the future of some relationships. Eugenia Washburn Larson, fearing the worst, reported feeling dense darkness when she imagined herself and other wives and children being turned adrift by husbands. Other plural wives, however, reacted to the manifestation with great relief. After the manifesto, Latter-day Saints believe that the Lord reveals his will line upon line, here a little, there a little. Church members living in 1890 generally believed that the manifesto was the work of the Lord. In Franklin D. Richards' words, but the full implications of the manifesto were not apparent at first. Its scope had to be worked out, and authorities differed on how best to proceed. We have been led to our present position by degrees, Apostle Heber J. Grant explained. Over time and through effort to receive continuing revelation, church members saw by degrees how to interpret the manifesto going forward. At first, many church leaders believed the manifesto merely suspended plural marriage for an indefinite time. Having lived, taught, and suffered for plural marriage for so long, it was difficult to imagine a world without it. George Q. Cannon, a counselor in the first presidency, likened the manifesto to the Lord's reprieve from the command to build temples in Missouri in 1830s after the saints were expelled from the state. In a sermon given immediately after the manifesto was sustained at General Conference, Cannon quoted a passage of Scripture in which the Lord excuses those who diligently seek to carry out a commandment from him, only to be prevented by their enemies. Behold, it behooveth me to require that work no more at the hands of those sons of men, but to accept of their offerings. Nevertheless, many practical matters had to be settled. The manifesto was silent on what existing plural families should do. On their own initiative, some couples separated or divorced as a result of the manifesto. Other husbands stopped cohabitating with all but one of their wives, but continued to provide financial and emotional support to all dependents. In closed-door meetings with local leaders, the first presidency condemned men who left their wives by using the manifesto as an excuse. I did not, could not, and would not promise that you would desert your wives and children, President Woodruff told the men. This you cannot do in honor. Believing that the covenants they made with God and their spouses had to be honored above all else, many husbands, including church leaders, continued to cohabit with their plural wives and fathered children with them well into the 20th century. Continued cohabitation exposed those couples to the threat of prosecution, just as it did before the manifesto. But these threats were markedly diminished after 1890. The manifesto marked a new relationship with the federal government and the nation. Prosecution of polygamists declined. Plural wives came out of hiding and assumed their married names, and husbands interacted more freely with their families, especially after U.S. President Benjamin Harrison granted general amnesty to Mormon polygamists in 1893. 3 years later, Utah became a state with a constitution that banned polygamy. The manifesto declared President Woodruff's intention to submit to the laws of the United States. It said nothing about the laws of other nations. Ever since the opening of colonies in Mexico and Canada, church leaders have performed plural marriages in those countries, and after October 1890, plural marriages continued to be quietly performed there. As a rule, these marriages were not promoted by church leaders and were difficult to get approved. Either one or both of the spouses who entered into these unions typically had to agree to remain in Canada or Mexico. Under exceptional circumstances, a small number of new plural marriages were performed in the United States between 1890 and 1904, though whether the marriages were authorized to have been performed within the United States is unclear. The precise number of new plural marriages performed during these years, inside and outside the United States, is unknown. Sealing records kept during this period typically did not indicate whether a sealing was monogamous or plural, making an exhaustive calculation difficult. A rough sense of scale, however, can be seen in a chronological ledger of marriages and sealings kept by church scribes. Between the late 1880s and the early 1900s, during a time when temples were few and travel to them was long and arduous, Latter-day Saint couples who lived far away from temples were permitted to be sealed in marriage outside them. The ledger of marriages and sealings performed outside the temple, which is not comprehensive, lists 315 marriages performed between October 17, 1890 and September 8, 1903. Of these 315 marriages recorded in the ledger, Research indicates that 25, or 7.9%, were plural marriages, and 290 were monogamous marriages, or 92.1%. Almost all the monogamous marriages were performed in Arizona or Mexico. Of the 25 plural marriages, 18 took place in Mexico, 3 in Arizona, 2 in Utah, and 1 each in Colorado and on a boat on the Pacific Ocean. Overall, the record shows that plural marriage was a declining practice and that church leaders were acting in good conscience to abide by the terms of the manifesto as they understood them. The exact process by which these marriages were approved remained unclear. For a time, post-manifesto plural marriages required the approval of a member of the First Presidency. There is no definitive evidence, however, that the decisions were made by the First Presidency as a whole. President Woodruff, for example, typically referred requests to allow new plural marriages to President Cannon for his personal consideration. By the late 1890s, at least some of the men who had authority to perform sealings apparently considered themselves free to either accept or reject requests at their own discretion, independent of the First Presidency. Apostle Heber J. Grant, for example, reported that while visiting Mormon settlements in Mexico in 1900, he received 10 applications in a single day requesting plural marriages. He declined them all. "I confess," he told a friend, "that it has always gone against my grain to have any violations of documents, i.e. the manifesto, of this kind." The Second Manifesto. At first, the performance of new plural marriages after the manifesto was largely unknown to people outside the church. When discovered, these marriages troubled many Americans, especially after President George Q. Cannon stated in 1899 in an interview with the New York Herald that new plural marriages might be performed in Canada and Mexico. After the election of B.H. Roberts, a member of the First Council of the 70, to the U.S. Congress, it became known that Roberts had 3 wives, one of whom he married after the manifesto. A petition of 7 million signatures demanded that Roberts not be seated. Congress complied, and Roberts was barred from his office. The exclusion of B.H. Roberts opened Mormon marital practices to renewed scrutiny. Church President Lorenzo Snow issued a statement clarifying that new plural marriages had ceased in the church and that the manifesto extended to all parts of the world. Counsel he repeated in private. Even so, a small number of new plural marriages continued to be performed, probably without President Snow's knowledge or approval. After Joseph F. Smith became church president in 1901, a small number of new plural marriages were also performed during the early years of his administration. The church's role in these marriages became a subject of intense debate after Reed Smoot, an apostle, was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1903. Although Smoot was a monogamist, his apostleship put his loyalty to the country under scrutiny. How could Smoot both uphold the laws of the church, some of whose officers had performed, consented to, or participated in a new plural marriages, and uphold the laws of the land, which made plural marriage illegal? For 4 years, legislators debated this question in lengthy public hearings. The Senate called on many witnesses to testify. Church President Joseph F. Smith took the stand in the Senate chamber in March 1904. When asked, he defended his family relationships, telling the committee that he had cohabited with his wives and fathered children with them since 1890. He said it would be dishonorable for him to break the sacred covenants he had made with his wives and with God. When questioned about new plural marriages performed since 1890, President Smith carefully distinguished between actions sanctioned by the church and ratified in church councils and conferences, and the actions undertaken by individual members of the church. There never has been a There never has been a plural marriage by the consent or sanction or knowledge or approval of the church since the manifesto, he testified. In this legal setting, President Smith sought to protect the church while stating the truth. His testimony conveyed a distinction church leaders had long understood. The manifesto removed the divine command for the church collectively to sustain and defend plural marriage. It had not, up to this time, prohibited individuals from continuing to practice or perform plural marriage as a matter of religious conscience. The time was right for a change in this understanding. A majority of Mormon marriages had always been monogamous, and a shift toward monogamy as the only approved form had long been underway. In 1889, a lifelong monogamist was called to the Quorum of the 12. After 1897, every new apostle called into the 12, with one exception, was a monogamist at the time of his appointment. Beginning in the 1890s, as church leaders urged members to remain in their native lands and build Zion in those places rather than immigrate to Utah, as in previous years, it became important for them to abide the laws mandating monogamy. During his Senate testimony, President Smith promised publicly to clarify the church's position about plural marriage. At the April 1904 General Conference, President Smith issued a forceful statement known as the Second Manifesto, attaching penalties to entering into plural marriage. If any officer or member of the church shall assume to solemnize or enter into any such marriage, he will be deemed in transgression against the church and will be liable to be dealt with according to the rules and regulations thereof and excommunicated therefrom. This statement had been approved by the leading councils of the church and was unanimously sustained at the conference as authoritative and binding on the church. The Second Manifesto was a watershed event. For the first time, church members were put on notice that new plural marriages stood unapproved by God and the church. The Second Manifesto expanded the reach and scope of the first. When the manifesto was given, Elder Francis M. Lyman, president of the Quorum of the 12, explained, it simply gave notice to the saints that they need not enter plural marriage any longer. But the action taken at the conference held in Salt Lake City on the 6th day of April 1904, or the Second Manifesto, made that manifesto prohibitory. Church leaders acted to communicate the seriousness of this declaration to leaders and members at all levels. President Lyman sent letters to each member of the Quorum of the 12 by direction of the First Presidency, advising them that the Second Manifesto would be strictly enforced. Contrary to direction, two apostles, John W. Taylor and Matthias F. Cowley, continued to perform and encourage new plural marriages after the Second Manifesto. They were eventually dropped from the quorum. Taylor was later excommunicated from the church after he insisted on his right to continue to perform plural marriages. Cowley was restricted from using his priesthood and later admitted that he had been wholly in error. Some couples who entered into plural marriage between 1890 and 1904 separated after the Second Manifesto, but many others quietly cohabitated into the 1930s and beyond. Church members who rejected the Second Manifesto and continued to publicly advocate plural marriage or undertake new plural marriages were summoned to church disciplinary councils. Some who were excommunicated coalesced into independent movements and are sometimes called fundamentalists. These groups are not affiliated with or supported by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Since the administration of Joseph F. Smith, church presidents have repeatedly emphasized that the church and its members are no longer authorized to enter into plural marriage and have underscored the sincerity of their words by urging local leaders to bring non-compliant members before church disciplinary councils. Conclusion. We're almost there. Marriage between one man and one woman is God's standard for marriage, unless he declares otherwise, which he did through his prophet Joseph Smith. The manifesto marked the beginning of the return to monogamy, which is the standard of the church today. Speaking at General Conference soon after the manifesto was given, President George Q. Cannon reflected on the revelatory process that brought the manifesto about. The presidency of the church have to walk just as you walk, he said. They have to take steps just as you take steps. They have to depend upon the revelations of God as they come to them. They cannot see the end from the beginning as the Lord does. All that we can do, Cannon said, speaking of the first presidency, is to seek the mind and will of God, and when that comes to us, though it may come in contact with every feeling that we have previously entertained, we have no option but to take the step that God points out and to trust to him. Wow. Well, I'll leave some links in the description to, if you want even more information. There's some other really good YouTube videos about this topic that I'll put in there. And hopefully, if you made it this far, good for you.